Chapter 15, Working with Organized Labor. Challenges. After reading this chapter, you should be able to deal more effectively with the following challenges. Number 1, understand why employees join unions. Number 2, understand the National Labor Relations Wagner Act and how the National Labor Relations Board regulates labor practices in union elections. Number 3, describe labor relations in the United States and other parts of the world. Number 4, identify labor relations strategies and describe how they affect operational and tactical labor decisions. Number 5, describe the 3 phases of the labor relations process: union organizing, collective bargaining, and contract administration. Number 6, explain how the union grievance procedure works and why the supervisor's role is critical in achieving sound labor relations with a union. Number 7, identify the ways in which a union can affect the company's entire pattern of human resource management, including its staffing, employee development, compensation, and employee relations policies. Working with organized labor can be challenging. One of the greatest challenges managers experience is when union representatives and management are unable to come to an agreement on employee working conditions, and the union decides to exercise its right to strike. On the morning of September 24th, 2007, 74,000 members of the United Auto Workers, UAW, left their jobs at General Motors, GM, factories and began picketing in public areas near the factories. The union had just launched a nationwide strike for the first time in 37 years. The union leader, Ron Gattelfinger, expressed sorrow that a deal could not be reached. The strike between the United Auto Workers and General Motors lasted only 2 days before a new labor agreement was reached. The big sticking point that led to the breakdown in negotiations was the issue of healthcare costs. The centerpiece of the agreement that was ratified by the union membership is the creation of an independent trust that will take over some $51 billion of healthcare liabilities for GM's existing employees and over 280,000 of its retired workers. Healthcare costs add as much as $1,600 to the price of each GM vehicle, and it was critical to management to find a way to reduce these costs. Global competitors in the auto industry in Asia and Europe do not face such expensive healthcare costs because governments in other countries often cover the cost of health insurance. Over the years, GM had lost market share in the United States to competitors such as Toyota, Honda, and Hyundai, who have much lower employee health costs than GM. The trust was set up with about $35 billion and allows GM to get the liability of providing healthcare funds for large numbers of retirees off its balance sheet. The union benefits from this deal on healthcare costs because it protects its member against the possibility that GM will go bankrupt and will be unable to meet its health coverage obligations for retired union members. The managerial perspective. The relationship between managers and their employees changes in a unionized organization. The law requires managers to meet and confer with elected union representatives when making decisions that affect pay, hours of employment, or working conditions. When unionized employees are dissatisfied with pay or other job factors, the company faces the possibility of a strike or other form of collective action designed to pressure the firm to respond to employees' preferences. Managers then need to understand the basics of labor relations and labor law to handle day-to-day labor management relations effectively. The presence of a union increases managers' need for HR services. HR specialists in labor relations can help managers develop tactics and strategies to work constructively with the union and its representatives in areas such as negotiating the terms of a new labor contract, interpreting a labor contract, or responding to an employee grievance. Managers that grasp the basics of labor relations will know when to turn to HR specialists and what questions to ask. In this chapter, we explore the labor management relationship between companies and unions. We begin by examining why employees join unions and why some employers prefer the workplace not to be unionized. Second, we outline the major U.S. legislation that governs labor issues and describe the current labor relations climate in the United States and in some other countries. Third, we investigate different labor relations strategies and explore the rules and procedures that govern union activities. Finally, we address the impact of unions on a variety of HR practices. Why do employees join unions? What is a union? A union is an organization that represents employees' interest to management on such issues as wages, work hours, and working conditions. A union is an organization that represents employees' interests to management on issues such as wages, work hours, and working conditions. Employees participate in administering the union and supporting its activities with union dues, fees they pay for the union services. The law protects employees' rights to join and participate in unions. The law also requires employers to bargain and confer with a union over certain employment issues that affect unionized employees. Issues that affect unionized employees. Employees join unions for different reasons. For example, in Israel, employees join unions because many believe in the social justice the union represents. Employees in the United States seek union representation when they, 1, are dissatisfied with certain aspects of their job, 2, feel that they lack influence with management to make the needed changes, and 3, see unionization as a solution to their problems. The union's best ally is bad management. If managers listen to employees, give them some say in the policies that affect their jobs, and treat them fairly, employees usually will not feel the need to organize. Managers who ignore their workers' interest can treat them inconsistently, often end up having to deal with a union. Companies usually prefer a non-union workforce. The primary reason is that wages are typically higher for union employees, which puts unionized companies at a competitive disadvantage if their competitors are not unionized. In addition, unions constrain what managers can and cannot do with a particular employee. For instance, a unionized employee who is doing a particularly good job usually cannot be given a merit raise or promoted over someone who has greater seniority, and many labor agreements spell out the specific work responsibilities of certain employees, which reduces flexibility in work assignments. Of course, many unionized companies flourish, and unions have some very positive social benefits. For example, a study reported that unions boosted productivity at hospitals by 16% compared to non-union hospitals. But given the choice, most managers would prefer a non-union environment. The origins of U.S. labor unions. Unions, as we think of them today, were largely unprotected by law in the United States until 1935. The approach of the U.S. government to unions prior to 1935 was simple. In a free market economy, the employment relationship is essentially a private one, and both employee and employer are free to accept or reject this relationship if they find it unsatisfactory. See discussion of employment at will in Chapter 14. In a free market economy, the employment relationship is essentially a private one, and both employee and employer are free to accept or reject this relationship if they find it unsatisfactory. This thinking regards the employer and employee as in similar positions of power. Employees who find their compensation unfair or working conditions unreasonable are free to find another job. Employers who are unhappy with an employee's performance can fire that employee. In practice, of course, the employers have considerably more power than individual employees. A large steel manufacturer does not miss one employee who quits, because there's usually a ready supply of applicants to replace that person. However, a large employer can so dominate a neighborhood, city, or region that there are few or no other employment alternatives. The large steel mills in Pittsburgh, the auto manufacturers in Detroit, the coal mine operators in Appalachia, and the tire companies in Akron are examples of employers and industries that have dominated their respective regions. In the Great Depression of the 1930s, millions of workers lost their jobs as employers came under tremendous pressure to cut production costs. These cutbacks put even more pressure on the working class. It was in this environment that union activity as we know it was legalized by the Wagner Act of 1935, which attempted to equalize the power of employers and employees. In fact, this goal explained much of the governmental and societal response to union activity during the Depression in the years following World War II. Unions were widely supported because of the public perception that working people had little power. Toward the end of the 20th century, however, public perception had changed. When President Reagan ordered the firing of striking air traffic controllers on August 5, 1981, 2 days after they began an illegal strike, the terminated employees received little sympathy from society at large, probably because unions were widely perceived to have become too powerful. This action took place in the middle of a period of dramatic decline in strikes in the United States. From a peak of 424 in 1974 strikes, decreased to 21 in 2007. However, unions are growing in some fields, such as medicine, as unions tackle new issues and represent workers in new professions. Public perception of union activities is likely to change. The role of the manager in labor relations. What are labor relations? Labor relations specialist, someone, often a member of the HR department, who is knowledgeable about labor relations and can represent management interests to a union. When a union represents a group of employees in a company, the company needs a staff of specialists who can represent management's interests to the union. These labor relations specialists, who are often members of the HR department, help resolve grievances, negotiate with the union over changes in the labor contract, and provide advice to top management in labor relations strategy. Still, it is managers who bear the majority responsibility for day-to-day labor management relations. Thus, it is important that they understand the workplace issues associated with unions. First, as we noted earlier, unions generally take hold only in firms where employees are dissatisfied with their jobs, and managers greatly influence how employees perceive their work environment. Second, where there is a union, managers are responsible for the day-to-day implementation of the terms of the labor agreement. The more effectively they carry out this responsibility, the less time the company will spend resolving labor conflicts. Third, managers need to have a basic understanding of labor law so that they do not unintentionally create a legal liability for the company. Finally, individual managers are often asked to serve on committees to hear grievances brought by union members against the company. A manager who understands general labor issues will be better prepared to hear and decide such cases. Because the nature and function of unions are so dependent on legislation, we look at the specifics of that legislation next. Labor relations and the legal environment. The key labor relations legislation in the United States consists of 3 laws enacted between 1930s and 1950s. The Wagner Act, 1935, the Taft-Hartley Act, 1947, and the Landrum-Griffin Act, 1959. These laws regulate labor relations in the private sector. Public sector labor relations are covered by federal or state laws that are patterned after these laws. In the history of labor relations law in the United States, the government has tried to balance employers' right to operate their businesses free from unnecessary interference. 2. Unions' right to organize and bargain for their members. And 3. Individual employees' right to choose their representatives or to decide that they do not want or need union representation. Before 1935, employer rights were essentially unchecked by federal legislation. After passage of the Wagner Act, however, many felt that union rights were too strongly protective relative to both employer and individual employee rights. This sentiment led Congress to pass 2 laws, the Taft-Hartley Act and the London Briefing Act in an attempt to achieve balance. The Wagner Act. The Wagner Act, also known as the National Labor Relations Act, was passed during the Great Depression in 1935. It was designed to protect employees' right to form and join unions, and to engage in activities such as strikes, picketing, and collective bargaining. The Wagner Act created the National Labor Relations Board, an independent federal agency charged with administering U.S. labor law. The NLRB's primary functions are, number one, to administer certification elections, secret ballot elections that determine whether employees want to be represented by union, and two, to prevent and remedy unlawful acts called unfair labor practices. The NLRB remedies an unfair labor practice by issuing a cease and desist order, which requires the guilty party to stop engaging in the unlawful labor practice. The Wagner Act identified 5 illegal labor practices that can be remedied by the National Labor Relations Board. Number 1, interfering with restraining or coercing employees to keep them from exercising the rights to form unions, bargain collectively, or engage in concerted activities for mutual protection. Number 2, dominating or interfering with the formation or administration of a union or providing financial support for it. Number 3, discriminating against an employee to discourage union membership. Discrimination can include not hiring a union supporter or not promoting, firing, or denying a pay raise to an employee who is a union member or who favors union representation. Number 4, discharging or otherwise discriminating against an employee who has filed charges or given testimony under the Act's provisions. Number 5, refusing to bargain collectively with the union that employees choose to represent them. The NLRB sometimes has difficulty enforcing its unfair labor practice rules because large corporations often use sophisticated tactics to avoid unions. As described in the Manager's Notebook, Walmart's Union Avoidance Tactics, Manager's Notebook, Ethics, Walmart's Union Avoidance Tactics. In the summer of 2000, Walmart's Kingsman, Arizona Tire and Lube Express TLE employees contacted the United Food and Commercial Workers seeking union representation. The union filed a representation petition on August 28th, and 2 days later, a labor relations team from Walmart corporate headquarters arrived at the store. During the union organizing campaign, members of the labor relations team did a number of things, including threatening to postpone merit pay increases for TLE employees during any contract negotiations, engaging in surveillance of employees' union activities, granting benefits and improved working conditions to discourage employees from supporting the union, discriminatorily and disparately applying and enforcing its no harassment policies to the detriment of employees who supported the union, and discharging and denying COBRA health benefit continuation coverage to employees for supporting the union. The union filed charges of unfair labor practices with the National Labor Relations Board, NLRB, against Walmart in 2000 due to the unfair way the company treated its employees who favored the union. The NLRB issued its final decision and remedial order nearly 8 years later in June of 2008. What took so long? Walmart's legal staff used delay tactics in complying with the law and then appealed the decision to a federal court. By the time Walmart exhausted its appeals on every claim made by the union and 8 years had passed, few of the original TLE employees who had supported the union remained at the store. In the future, it should not be difficult for Walmart to claim that the majority of employees no longer want a union and encourages employees to petition the NLRB to conduct an election to decertify the union. The Taft-Hartley Act. The Taft-Hartley Act, enacted in 1947, shortly after the end of World War II, was designed to limit some of the power that unions acquired under the Wagner Act and to protect the rights of management and employees. Although the Taft-Hartley Act was basically favorable to management interests, its goals were to adjust the regulation of labor management relations to ensure a level playing field for both parties. Taft-Hartley included remedies for the National Labor Relations Board for 6 unfair union labor practices. Number 1, restraining or coercing employees in the exercise of their rights guaranteed under the Act and or coercing an employer's choice of a representative in collective bargaining. Number 2, causing or attempting to cause an employer to discriminate against an employee who is not a member of a labor union for any reason other than failure to pay the union dues and initiation fees uniformly required as condition of acquiring or retaining membership in the union. Number 3, refusing to bargain in a good faith with an employer after a majority of the employees in a unit have elected the union as their representative. Number 4, asking or requiring its members to boycott products made by a firm engaged in labor dispute with another union, secondary boycott. However, a union can call a boycott of products produced by its own firm, primary boycott. Number 5, charging employees excessive or discriminatory union dues as condition of membership in a union under a union shop clause. A union shop clause requires employees to join the union 30 to 60 days after the date of hire. Number 6, causing an employer to pay for services that are not performed. This practice, often called feather bedding, is technically illegal, but the definition of unnecessary and unperformed work is often murky. For example, railroad unions continue to require the presence of firemen on engines long after their main duty. Taking care of the fire on the steam engine was eliminated by the advent of diesel engines. 12 years later, the Landrum-Griffin Act added a 7th unfair union labor practice. It is illegal for a union to picket an employer for the purpose of union recognition, a practice known as recognitional picketing. Perhaps the most controversial provision of the Taft-Hartley Act is Section 14B, which gives permission to the states to enact right-to-work laws. A right-to-work law makes it illegal within a state for a union to include a union shop clause in its contract. Unions negotiate union shop clauses into their contracts to provide greater security to union employees and prevent non-union employees from receiving union services without paying union dues. A less restrictive arrangement called the agency shop clause requires employees to pay a union service fee about equal to union dues, but does not require them to join the union. Currently, 22 states have right-to-work laws, which make it more difficult to organize and sustain unions in those states. Most of these states are located in the southern or western United States, away from major industrial centers. Several other provisions of Taft-Hartley are noteworthy. First, the Act made closed shops require an employee to be a union member as a condition of being hired illegal. This provision was modified 12 years later by the Landrum-Griffin Act to allow a closed shop in the construction industry as the only exception. Second, Taft-Hartley allowed employees to get rid of a union they no longer want through a decertification election and charge the NLRB with regulation decertification elections. Finally, Taft-Hartley created a new agency, the Federal Mediation and Conciliation Service, to help mediate labor disputes so that economic disruptions due to strikes and other labor disturbances would be fewer and shorter. The Landrum-Griffin Act. The Landrum-Griffin Act was enacted in 1959 to protect union members and their participation in union affairs. It allows the government, through the Department of Labor, to regulate union activities. The Landrum-Griffin Act includes the following key provisions. Number 1, each union must have a Bill of Rights for union members to ensure minimum standards of internal union democracy. Number 2, each union must adopt a constitution and provide copies of it to the Department of Labor. Number 3, each union must report its financial activities and the financial interests of its leaders to the Department of Labor. Number 4, union elections are regulated by the government and union members have the right to participate in secret ballot elections. Number 5, union leaders have a fiduciary responsibility to use union money and property for the benefit of the membership and not for their own personal gain. Members can sue and recover damages from union leaders who fail to exercise their fiduciary responsibilities. Other laws that affect labor relations include the Railway Labor Act 1926, last amended in 1970, the Norris-LaGuardia Act 1932, and the Burns Anti-Strike Breaking Act 1938. Of course, the Equal Employment Opportunity laws discussed in Chapter 3 also apply to unionized workers. Most noteworthy of these other labor laws is the Railway Labor Act, which regulates labor relations in the transportation industry. This law covers the railway, airlines, and trucking industries that are critical to sustain commerce. It provides dispute settlement procedures if the parties are unable to achieve a labor agreement. The Railway Labor Act has provisions for congressional and presidential intervention in a labor dispute that could be disruptive to interstate commerce. For example, the president intervened in a labor dispute in the airline industry when one of the major airlines forced the union to go on strike because of a breakdown in negotiations. Although much of U.S. labor relations law is more than 5 decades old, it would be a mistake to assume that nothing new is happening in this area. More recently, Congress was considering the Teamwork for Employees and Management Act, which would amend the Wagner Act to ensure that employers are permitted to establish and maintain employee involvement programs. Another set of amendments under consideration would eliminate an employer's right to use permanent replacements during an economic strike or work stoppage. In Canada, several provinces have recently enacted laws that restrict employers from using replacement workers during strikes. Clearly, the struggle to find the correct balance of employer, union, and employee rights is ongoing. We now turn to a description of the current state of labor relations in the United States. Labor relations in the United States. Labor relations in the United States evolved from the philosophy of the U.S. labor movement, which accepted the country's capitalist economic structure and wanted to operate within it. U.S. unions have avoided a permanent affiliation with a political party and have focused on improving their members' welfare through dealing directly with the companies that employ their members. The key factors that characterize labor relations in the United States are: number 1, business unionism; number 2, unions structured by type of job; number 3, a focus on collective bargaining; number 4, labor contracts; number 5, the adversarial nature of labor management relations and shrinking union membership; and number 6, the growth of unions in the public sector. Business unionism. Business unionism is unionism that focuses on bread and butter issues such as wages, benefits, and job security. So that workers get a larger slice of the economic pie, U.S. unions, which practice business unionism, have traditionally avoided trying to influence the running of the company, and they provide little input to management on strategic decisions, such as how to market a product or what types of new business to enter. It is rare to see U.S. union members on a company's board of directors. U.S. labor laws reinforce this tendency by making wages, hours, and working conditions mandatory topics for bargaining. This means that management is obligated to bargain on these issues in good faith. Unions structured by type of job. In contrast to unions in some other countries, U.S. unions tend to be organized by type of job. For instance, truck drivers are often members of the Teamsters Union. Many public school teachers are members of the National Education Association. And most auto workers belong to the United Auto Workers, no matter which automaker employs them. Because most unions represent employees from multiple employers, they're typically arranged into locals, governed by a national body. Each local consists of the union members in particular geographic location. The local has its own offices and is generally concerned with day-to-day labor practices and disputes. The national organization ties these locals together, governs how locals are organized and operated, and most importantly, establishes policy for contract negotiations. The AFL-CIO, formed by the merger of the old American Federation of Labor and the Congress of Industrial Organization, is a confederation of many different unions. Because it represents so many workers, approximately 10 million, the AFL-CIO has a tremendous influence on federal labor policies. It also provides support to individual national unions and mobilizes support for laws that are beneficial to working people. Finally, the AFL-CIO resolves disputes between national unions. In 2005, 4 large unions representing 4 million employees voted to disaffiliate from the AFL-CIO and become independent. These unions that left the AFL-CIO were the Service Employees International Union and the International Brotherhood of Teamsters, the United Food and Commercial Workers Union, and Unite Here, a union of apparel and hotel workers. These unions wanted the organized labor movement to spend more time and money recruiting new members. Shortly afterward, the laborers, carpenters, and United Farm Workers unions joined this group of independent unions and formed Change to Win. Currently, Change to Win is a confederation that represents 7 unions with close to 6 million members. Focus on collective bargaining. Unions and management are the dominant players in the U.S. labor relations system. Generally, the U.S. government takes a neutral role, allowing the players to make the rules that govern their particular workplace. The mechanism of choice for developing these rules is collective bargaining. Under a collective bargaining system, unions and management negotiate with each other to develop the work rules under which union members will work for a stipulated period of time, usually 2 or 3 years. Work rules include any terms or conditions of employment, including pay, work breaks and lunch periods, vacation, work assignments, and grievance procedures. Unions that are legally elected by workers in the United States act as the sole representatives of those workers' concerns to management. Although unions may compete for recognition, once one is recognized, individual employees cannot choose to be represented by another union. Labor contracts. The product of collective bargaining is a labor contract that spells out the conditions of employment and work rules that affect employees in the unit represented by the union. Because both parties enter into the contract voluntarily, one party can use the legal system to enforce the terms of the contract if the other party does not fulfill its responsibilities. Labor contracts are an important feature of the U.S. labor relations system. In many other countries, such as Germany and Sweden, working conditions and employee benefits are codified into labor laws. But in the United States, labor and management have historically established workers' economic benefits without government interference. The adversarial nature of labor management relations and shrinking union membership. U.S. labor laws view labor and management as natural adversaries who will disagree over the distribution of the firm's profits. For this reason, rules have been put in place so that the pie is distributed peacefully. In a sense, the U.S. labor relations system is modeled on the U.S. court system. In a court, justice may be considered the result of the clash of adversaries, with the district attorney representing the plaintiff's interest and the defense attorney representing the defendant's interest. Similarly, economic justice may be considered the result of negotiations between the union, the advocate of the employees, and management, the advocate of the firm's owners. Although this adversarial model worked well for many years in the United States, it has recently become an obstacle to union management cooperation, which has grown in importance as both labor markets and product markets have become more globally competitive. As figure 15.1 shows, 12% of the U.S. labor force is unionized. This is down from a peak of about 35% in 1945. In addition, only 7% of the private sector workforce in the United States is unionized. There are several reasons for this decline: the shrinking base of blue-collar industrial jobs, the traditional area of unionization due to the automation and foreign competition, the increase in employment legislation that provides workers with remedies that address their needs, and the aggressively hostile labor relations strategies of many companies, which have made it difficult for unions to organize workers. Other possible reasons for declining union membership are an increasingly educated workforce, as well as the highly publicized legal problems of some union leaders. Despite shrinking union membership, unions continue to be an important part of the U.S. labor relations system because they establish wage and benefit patterns that influence non-union employers. In this way, unions indirectly affect about 40 to 50% of the U.S. labor force. In fact, many employees of non-union firms benefit from the upward adjustments in their wages and benefits that their employers make to prevent the union from organizing their workers. Unions have also pioneered worker safety measures and anti-discriminatory labor practices. Unless the underlying causes that gave birth to unions are abolished, low wages, unsafe working conditions, health hazards, arbitrary firings, and layoffs, it is a safe bet that unions will not disappear. The growth of unions in the public sector. As the percentage of unionized workers in a private sector has declined, the percentage of unionized workers in the public sector has increased substantially. This increase is due in part to the expansion of local government in the 1980s, and in part to organizing efforts that have targeted both public sector and service sector employees. Let's take a look at a graph here. Percent of the labor force and the year from 1930 to 2010. We can see that the percent keeps going lower and lower. The union membership in the United States from 1930 to 2010. Currently, the union membership rate for public sector workers, which includes those working for federal, state, and local governments, is 37%, 5 times higher than the membership rate in the private sector. In addition, since 2010, unionized workers in the public sector represent a majority of all unionized workers in the United States. Unions in the public sector are in many ways a special case of labor relations, because although public sector employees are more likely to be organized than private sector ones, public sector workers tend to have less bargaining power. There are two main reasons for this difference. First, governmental power is diffuse. The typical private sector firm is organized hierarchically. The typical private sector firm is organized hierarchically so that there is one individual at the top who is in charge. However, governmental bodies in the United States have been intentionally structured so that power is divided among the legislative, executive, and judicial branches. This makes it more difficult for public sector unions to negotiate and bargain collectively because the employer's representative often has only limited authority. For instance, a city employees union may bargain with mayor's office for higher pay, but the money for the higher salaries has to be appropriated by city council, which may not concur with the mayor. The second reason public sector unions have less power is that many governmental entities severely restrict their employees' right to strike. The reasoning is that the government is a monopoly provider of essential services such as police protection, garbage collection, and highway maintenance. If its employees were to go on strike, there would be no one else to provide these essential services. States differ in restrictiveness on this issue. For instance, Colorado forbids strikes by any state employees, including teachers. In contrast, New York, Michigan, Wisconsin, and some other states give some of their employees the right to strike in certain circumstances. Because their right to strike is limited, public sector unions have taken the lead in devising and experimenting with new ways to negotiate, including mandated arbitration and mediation. Their limited economic power has also made public sector unions less likely than private sector unions to put pay issues at the top of their agendas. For instance, teachers' unions often focus on such issues as class size, job security, and academic freedom rather than straight salary issues. Although having government as an employer can present difficulties to unionized workers, it also brings certain advantages. One is that union members, by virtue of the fact that they are also voters, have some political power over their employer. Because voter participation in non-federal elections is often low in the United States, a well-organized public sector union can be a powerful force in local politics. In fact, even national candidates court public sector union support. A second advantage stems from the very diffusion of power we discussed earlier. This makes it possible for the union to play one branch of government against the other in certain circumstances. For instance, a union may be able to achieve a bargaining victory because it has the support of a city council member whose vote of the major needs on some unrelated issue. For instance, a union may be able to achieve a bargaining victory because it has the support of a city council member whose vote the major needs on some unrelated issue. Labor relations in other countries. Labor relations systems vary from country to country because unions mean different things in different countries. In the United States, labor relations involves collective bargaining and labor contracts. But in Sweden and Denmark, it involves national wage setting. In Japan, it involves enterprise unions that cooperate with company management. In Great Britain, it involves union affiliation with the Labour Party, and in Germany, it involves union representation on the company's board of directors. Moreover, the shrinking percentage of private sector employees represented by unions in the United States is not a world trend. Unions not only represent a large portion of the labor force in most other industrialized countries, but are also important factors in the labor relations systems of many of those countries. Figure 15.2 compares union membership as a percentage of the labor force in 13 industrialized countries, including the United States. Union membership as a percentage of the labor force is higher in most European countries, with Italy and Sweden having respectively 34% and 78% of their workers represented by unions in 2006. Although unionism declined in Great Britain in the 1980s, British unions still represented 29% of the workforce in 2006, double the percentage of US workers. Even in Japan, whose firms seek to avoid unions when they locate factories in the United States, 20% of workers are unionized. This is significantly higher than the US percentage. Percent of total civilian wage salary employees belonging to unions. United States, Canada, Austria, Australia, Japan, Denmark, France, Germany, Italy, Netherlands, Sweden, Switzerland, United Kingdom. Figure 15.2. Union membership in selected countries, 1965 to 2006. How unions differ internationally. One analysis of unionism around the globe suggests that unions in different countries have different priorities. As we have seen, U.S. unions place a very strong emphasis on economic issues, particularly pay, benefits, and job security. For example, in recent years, outsourcing has become a major concern of U.S. unions, because the first jobs to be subcontracted tend to be blue-collar jobs, the union's mainstay. Compared to unions in other countries, U.S. unions place much less emphasis on political issues. Political involvement is just another means to address economic concerns. At the other end of the spectrum, unions in France tend to be much more politically involved and less concerned with economic issues. The two largest labor confederations in France have clear political orientations, and one is even religiously oriented. Strikes in France tend to focus on political change as a primary means of protecting or improving conditions for union members. In 2010, French unions led a political protest of up to 3 million people who marched in the streets of France to voice their opposition to a law that would increase the legal minimum retirement age from 60 to 62 years. Unions in Spain also used political tactics to carry out their goals. For example, in 2002, Spanish unions collaborated to organize a one-day general strike to convince the political leaders to reject the government proposal to lower the level of employment benefits for Spanish workers. A general strike is a work stoppage of all organized labor over a brief, predetermined time period that is designed to influence the government to support a particular political goal representing the interest of workers. In China, unions are low in both economic and political involvement. Because of the pervasive control of the Chinese Communist Party over both political and economic affairs, while the right to strike has been illegal in China, this restriction may be changing after workers in a Chinese Honda plant successfully used the strike in 2010 to achieve higher wages. China is now considering a law that will relax the ban on strikes if the union first attempts to negotiate peacefully with management over the relevant economic issues. Finally, Swedish unions tend to have a high degree of economic and political involvement.